Good evening, and today we talk about punk in British and punk in Wuhan. So it's quite different context, political and economic culture context. So maybe an interesting topic. We invite this book's author, Professor Wally, and artist Chris Yuan to come to here to present their book and their art to us today. So firstly, we have Professor Wally to introduce his book, No Future, Punk, Politics, and the British Youth Culture, 1976 to 1984. Okay.
Thank you very much. I've got some pictures that I can see, but you can't. And I'm going to keep them there just to prompt me to think about certain things, but sorry about that. I can't hold up on this one. They're really good. Fantastic. Best PowerPoint ever.
Maybe you can, if you're thinking.
Oh no. They'll just ruin it a little bit. Yeah, so, well, thanks very much for inviting me to talk here, and thanks for coming. It's a book I wrote a couple of years ago, looking at punk, and I wanted to contextualise this well-renowned cultural moment from a British perspective, emerging in the middle of the 1970s, which I followed through to 1984, and I did that very deliberately for the Orwellian overtones of 1984, which I suggest kind of run through British punk, really from the outset. It was a kind of a dystopian Orwellian feel to some aspects of British punk. Famously, one of the first songs by The Clash, 1977, all about 1977 at the end, counts down to 1984, so it's there very much from the start. So I start in 1976 when punk kind of gets its name in a British context, and I go through to 1984. What I didn't want to do with it was just to tell the story. I think the story of British punk is generally quite well known. What I was more interested in was firstly, what did punk and punk-related cultures tell us about Britain in the 1970s and the 1980s? Can you use, and here's the academic bit, can you use punk as a lens to understand the changes that are going on at that period? Very evidently, the kind of breakdown of post-war consensus, fault lines of post-war consensus really begin to open up in the 1970s, and the decades famously still renowned for being a period of social tension and economic unrest, etc., etc. You can't watch a documentary on the 1970s without seeing images of striking miners, bin bags piling high. You know the cliches, you've seen all before. And also the advent of Thatcherism, of course. Now, if you follow punk beyond its initial moment in Britain, 76, 77 into the 1980s, one of the things I want to bring out, I guess this was maybe my midlife crisis showing that I grew up at this time, was that punk, for me, remained very important in the 1980s. It didn't disappear when the Sex Pistols split up, or when the Clash released London Calling. It retained. And I was very informed by it as a teenager in the early 1980s, and so I kind of wanted to recover that aspect of British punk as well. So yeah, so the book's from 76 to 84. It's not chronology, it's thematic, and I'm going to take you through the general themes today, which is basically how I'm going to frame the talk. I obviously started off with a bit of the background, talking about the way in which the word punk had been fizzing about the kind of music journalist lexicon for some time, being applied this way and that way, primarily to American garage bands in the 60s. It's famously in some sleeve notes that Lenny Kaye wrote for the Nuggets compilation of garage bands from the 1960s. Suicide, one of the great American bands, they were saying they were doing punk music in 1970s. I think that's about the earliest I've seen it used as a kind of punk music form. So the term doesn't come out of nowhere in 1976, but it's very quickly applied to, famously, the Sex Pistols. The first time the Sex Pistols were reviewed in the NME in February 1976. The reviewer, Neil Spencer, labels it punk rock, says this is like punk rock, meaning it's like the garage band from the 1960s. It's fast rock and roll stripped down to its bare essentials, basically speaking. So this word kind of people are desperate to use this word, I think, and find something to apply it to. And the Sex Pistols are just perfect. I won't go into the whole kind of background to the Sex Pistols and stuff, other than to say that they were, as it's well known, the most kind of prominent of the British punk bands to emerge in 1976-77, formed in 1975, properly first gigs in 1975, split up in January 1978. For many people, that's all you need to know. But I think there's a lot more to it. In their wake, a lot of bands are inspired and informed by them, most famously The Clash. Every city around the country by the end of 1976, start 1977, will have had a punk band. In my home city of Norwich, we had a band called the Turkey Molesters, which is probably one of the worst punk names. Thankfully, they disappeared very quickly and never left any recorded trace of them, which is good. But anyway, everywhere we've had bands forming. So I'm interested in that way as well, the way it kind of disseminates out. But part of how that happens, I think, it's a famous moment, but it is is this too grand a term, an epochal moment? Is the famous incident when the Sex Pistols swear on television in December 1976, and a moral panic ensues. And it is an important moment, I think, because it takes punk out of being a thing that the music press are talking about, and it's interesting. And it's these new bands doing this thing, and it's a bit different, and it's subversive, it's a little bit violent, what's going on. It goes from being kind of subcultural to pop cultural, I think, once it has this kind of moral panic ensues about the Sex Pistols and get kicked off their record label, the tours banned. A bit later they're going to release God Save the Queen to coincide with Queen Elizabeth's Jubilee, and there's another scandal there, and that goes from being an antisocial scandal to being a slightly seditious scandal. There's a bit more to it. It's not just swearing on television, it's being oppositional and anti-establishment, and it adds this, the rhetoric around punk about trying to find out, what are the kids revolting against? What are these revolting kids? I think that's a real shift when it goes from being underground to overground. And then the story's quite well known, so I'm not going to carry on with that. What I will do though is begin telling you about the themes. Now, just before I do that, I'm going to use punk in a very open-ended way. I'm not interested really in trying to define it in a neat, tidy, inward way. I think what makes punk interesting is the way it evolves outwards and the way it informed the culture and cultural space and other cultural forms around it at the time. So when I talk about punk, I'm not just talking about the Sex Pistols and the Clash and the bands of 76, 77. I'm going to be talking about the bands that were influenced by the spaces opened up by the Sex Pistols and the Clash in 1976, 77. And that begins to take in a whole range of kind of sub-genres and sub-cultures that, again, I think it's very much part of this history that I'm interested in. At the end of 1977, John Savage wrote a famous piece in Sounds called The New Music, he called it. Music spelled M-U-S-I-C-K. And in it, he talks about post-punk projections, the fact that punk had to go from being angry to alienated. And it's really the beginning of someone conceptualizing what now people talk about as being post-punk. Music that comes out of punk but isn't just quick, fast rock and roll. There's something more going on, something more experimental. Around the same time as that, emerging kind of parallel, you've got your industrial culture, bands like Throbbing Gristle from up the road, not too far from here, in Hackney, forming an industrial culture. Punk famously was about 3 chords. Throbbing Gristle said no chords. It's just music and noise and sound, capturing the kind of environment and the mood of the time. And it goes on. You get subcultural revivals, new mod, rockabillys come back, touched by the hand of punk, psychobillies, the skinhead revival, and there's Oi, a kind of stripped down version of a kind of prole aesthetic of early British punk, kind of made manifest. Anarcho-punk, with the band Crass to the forefront of that, and Poison Girls, and a whole kind of swathe of anarcho bands forming into the 1980s. Around Rough Trade in London, you get, and really stimulated also by Buzzcocks in Manchester, there's a flowering of independent labels, people making their own records cheaply, printing them, distributing them themselves, experimenting necessarily because they haven't got the technicality, technical ability, or means to produce pop music in any sophisticated sense. As a result, come up with lots of really interesting, I think, kind of ways of reinventing rock and roll in this way, touched in many ways, and often with a very political rationale behind it. And then by the time you're into the 80s, you've got a whole swathe of punk bands who hold on to being punk and play punk music in a punk way, looking punk and being punk. Bands like The Exploited and all those kind of bands of the 80s. So my net is cast wide. I see punk as something that diffused through British youth culture in the 70s and 80s, touched many things in many different ways. I haven't even mentioned the new romantics and all that kind of stuff, but they're in there as well. All responding in different ways to this moment in 76, 77 that seemed to act as a catalyst for British youth culture and British music in different ways. Okay, so let me take you through how I structured the book. I start off by looking at punk as a cultural critique. In that when you read the interviews from the time, and I should say my method for the book was not to do oral histories with people now looking back, it was to use material from the time. I used the music press interviews, fanzines, documentaries made at the time. I wanted to capture what people said they were doing when they were doing it, not what they remembered they were doing it a long time later. Because I wanted to use the language that was being used at the time and capture the moment of becoming, punk becoming. And early on in 76, most of the rhetoric is a cultural critique. It's saying that pop music's gone rubbish, rock and roll's gone rubbish, it's getting too old. There's the stuff that you can see bubbling up in the music press before. I was looking at a Melody Maker from February 1976, and there was a big letter in there, someone complaining about Robert Plant becoming a tax exile and moving out and not paying his fair share and leaving the kids behind. You know, and that becomes part of the punk rhetoric. So this is kind of cultural critique going on that somehow popular music, particularly rock and roll, has detached itself. It's no longer exciting. It's getting old. It's no longer teenage. It's adult, isn't it? When you think of people like Robert Plant, I'm thinking of hairy blokes. I'm not thinking of young kids making music straight out of school. There's a great quote in the first Sniffing Glue, the first British punk fanzine, where Mark Perry talks about punk being, back to basics. Kids who've just left school and sniffing Airfix glue, to have a bit of fun, making music more accessible. Back to the grassroots. And it doesn't take long. You just have to watch an episode of Top of the Pops in 1976 to see that pop music, what is on the radio, on the television, remember with 3 channels, and pop music's only played on Radio 1 at the time, maybe 1 or 2 like Capital Radio and stuff. What a narrow kind of vision there is. You might have the old Bray Whistle test if you stay up late, but that's the hairy blokes again. So you can just see this over and over again. This seems the idea that there's been a kind of lull. Something had gone wrong somewhere or gone askew. And punk picks up on that, and there's this kind of big cultural critique about the need to rejuvenate, reinvigorate pop music and youth culture. And Clara and Vivienne Westwood, in their shop Sex on King's Road, to block that, wanting to recreate another exciting youth culture, like the Teddy Boys had been back in the 1950s. This cultural critique kind of rolls out after the incident where the sex pistols swear on the television, and you get the cultural critique getting slightly more sophisticated, I would say. Because when you see a moral panic happening to you, you realise how distorted the media lens can be. And you get a real shift of gear between punk disaffection at pop music's rubbish, or I don't like Queen, to the television's distorting the truth because they're reporting it wrongly. And again, you get a kind of narrative, a kind of media critique coming through that's slightly wider. This is already building on a disaffection with the music press. So I mentioned Mark Perry before in his first Sniffing Glue. His rationale for starting Sniffing Glue was because they're not talking enough about the Ramones. They're not talking about the things that he wants them to talk about. So he says, well, so we need to start our own media, our own press. So you begin to get this idea that media is not giving you what you wanted to give you, or serving you in the way that it wants to be served. You have to create your own. And so you get this out of experience, out of praxis, you get a kind of a cultural critique evolving through punk. in the background, you've got people like Jamie Reed and Malcolm McLaren who are quite savvy about all this and the way in which the media appropriates and all that kind of stuff, influenced famously by the Situationists in France, applying this in their iconography, or in the imagery for the sex discourse. So cultural critique is really important. That for me is the stimulus, and I can trace that through. Very quickly, given the context of the time, this is 1976, Britain's just applied to the IMF to be bailed out because its economy is in trouble. Unemployment's rising pretty much for the first time since the Second World War, and there's a lot of kind of concern about particularly youth unemployment. The lexicon, the language of decline and crisis is running through the media. Punk happens, this kind of slightly angry, disaffected youth culture at exactly this moment. Again, McLaren talks about capturing a mood, and that mood is darkening into the 1970s. So very quickly you get this kind of notion that punk relates to a form of social realism. So the second theme I follow through is social. Punk is a social realism. The most famous way into that, of course, is The Clash. Their first single about the Notting Hill riots of 1976, and writing about something they saw and they experienced. On the B side, the song I mentioned before, 1977, capturing kind of London in the midst of a social tension, social crisis, and Stengones in Knightsbridge and Knives in West 11, and things are closing down, counts down to 1984. And one of the things that Johnny Rotten or John Lydon used to talk a lot about was that the problem with the hippies was they become irrelevant. They become complacent. They were detached from reality. And so punk, very quickly, the rhetoric of punk begins to put a lot of emphasis on tapping into the world as it is and reporting about as it is. Now this can be just, if you're a band like The Damned, just what it's really like to be a teenager, not singing about the moon in June and isn't everything lovely, but about kind of teenage spills and thrills and tapping into what it really is like to be a teenager. But with The Clash, you kind of get this politics which kind of comes in. John Savage talks about The Clash giving punk a social conscience, where the Sex Pistols just wanted to hate and destroy everything. The Clash seemed to have this, what they call the anti-violence, pro-creative, anti-racist stance. It kind of gave it a bit of a social conscience. And so social realism is another way you can kind of trace through punk telling you how it is, what it's like to be a kid in the 1970s and 1980s, what it's like to deal with unemployment, what's it like to do a boring job, what it's like to have a terrible girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever, and not quite kitchen sink drama, but in a way I kind of see it as a bit of a kind of musical equivalent to those angry young men of the 1950s and 60s. Punk was also fascinated with abjection, with the idea that the reality that we were presented, particularly things like advertising and on the television, was a facade. There's a song by a band called The Gang of Four called a lyric called Dirt Behind the Daydream. And punk was very much into revealing that, pulling back the veneer of reality to show you all the blood and guts and gore that's going on underneath. I think that, again, feeds into this idea of this kind of social realism. Now, underpinning all that, I suggest, is that there are a kind of broader, kind of existential impulses beating through punk. All this talk of boredom that it sees, again, it's part of the punk language from the start. Everyone's bored of everything. Bored of school, bored of London, London's burning with boredom, Sheffield's burning with boredom, everywhere bored, looking bored. Caroline Coon says Johnny Rotten looks bored, and she emphasises looks. It's an affectation, it's something you're putting on your show. I've got kids now, and there's nothing that winds me up more as they tell me they're bored. But you know, it's a great trigger. And boredom's part of that thing, so I look at that, what are they talking about? And there's various things you can pick out. There is just that thing of being an insolent youth, and kind of having that. But I also look at punk in suburbia, and so my wave, that famous song by the Members called The Sound of the Suburbs. And quite a lot of punks, famously, were kids from outside the cities, and London's surround, and the provincial towns of Britain, you know, looking into London, thinking that's where it's exciting, that's where things must be happening. The jam in Woking, in the cities where things are happening. That's where you want to get to. And that suburban nothingness of Britain, that suburbia that exists between somewhere and nowhere, and between the town and the country, and it's a very part of a kind of British, maybe English, British English, I don't know, mindset. And so that song, Sound of the Suburbs, is brilliant, just captures that kid looking out the window, nothing's happening, he's got his guitar, he's got a band he plays in the youth club with, and he's just dreaming of getting out of this place. And so I look at punk and suburbia and all that kind of stuff. But the boredom kind of runs through, and it kind of feeds in, I think, also to I think done really well with the band X-Ray Specs and the kind of critique of the alienation of consumerism and consumption, which was a big topic in the 1960s and the 1970s. On their album German Free Adolescence and a number of singles, they talk an awful lot about the world becoming artificial and of feeling alienated by the adverts and the kind of barrage of media imagery that's being put towards them. So part of punk's boredom was this kind of response to the kind of media lens, the society perspective, I guess, of the 1970s. So I traced that kind of punk's boredom through that desire for something tangible and real. Like I say, these are quite existential things. I think a lot of punk is a kind of existential angst being played out at a particular time and place. Now, punk's often associated, people like to talk a lot about punk and its politics with a big P, because these were angry kids, so they must be angry about something, and some of them were, and some of them articulated it quite well, and kind of tapped into things that were going on. So I do a kind of a chapter all about punk and its politics. You can't write a song called Anarchy in the UK without expecting people to take it politically. You know, they're bound to the lyrics of the song and everything. So it's absolutely in there at that kind of kernel of punk. But it's also, you know, a very heightened political moment in Britain, I think. The far left and the far right are very visible in Britain in the mid-1970s. The political centres looking pretty, not academic word, ropey at the time. You know, the minority government, not much can get done. Labour in power, don't really know how to deal with the situation that's in front of them, or struggling to deal with the situation in front of them. Margaret Thatcher's become leader of the Conservative Party, is beginning to articulate a slightly different version of conservatism. These are politically charged moments, and they're playing out in the streets very much so. Emerging parallel with punk, of course, is rock against racism. So one of the chapters I'm looking at punk and its politics and its connections to kind of social movements, things like rock against racism. A bit later on I talk about punk and the feminist movement. But in this chapter I talk mainly about punk and rock against racism and the way in which punk began to articulate a political position. I should say political positions because it's plural, because depending on what band you look at, you're going to get lots of different responses, and what milieux of people, you're going to get lots of different responses. The rock against racism is one thing. The other area I find very interesting is this term anarchy, and the way this becomes part of punk's lexicon. It's fizzing around. As early as 1977, you've got fanzines discussing anarchy and going off and reading kind of anarchist thinkers and stuff like that. But it's the band Crass, I think, who really become visible properly at the start of 1979, who move things into a slightly different area. Them and Poison Girls are going to create a culture that's going to become known as anarcho-punk. They take the anarchy in punk very seriously and basically create a critique of society. They dissect all the props of power within society, from religion through to the law, through to education, through to the family, and write these songs with incredibly dense and complex lyrics, like Big A Little A and stuff like that, which is, you know, really quite sophisticated critique. You can be critical of their critique, but their critique has depth to it. And when the Falklands War happens in 1982, Crass are to the fore as in the protest against the Falklands War. They release a record of How Does It Feel to Be the Mother of 1,000 Dead, aimed directly at Margaret Thatcher, for which moral panic might be too strong a word, but which a furore was had around it. There's politics going in lots of different ways. There's lots of talk of anti-politics, of being against politics, which is a very political thing to say. So, you know, again, it's a kind of paradox of contradiction in punk. And you also had a very small contingent of punks begin to develop an interest in right-wing politics. This would flower really in the early 1980s around a band called Screwdriver, and who were members of the National Front, and they linked up with people from the British movement and the rock against communism, and White Noise Records and the whole, becomes a global franchise of Blood and Honor over time. It's a slow burn. There wasn't many bands aligning themselves in this way, even though punk played with some of the symbolism of politics, with swastikas and stuff like that. There weren't many people aligning themselves politically like that in 76, 77. But by the end of the decade, into the 1980s, you're beginning to get a kind of right-wing punk scene forming. Screwdriver, Ovaltine, bands like that. Okay, so that's punk with politics with a big P. I also look at punk with a small p, personal politics. Key thing about punk was the idea that it gave people autonomy and agency. It showed you anyone could do it, you could do it yourself. As I mentioned before, and I'll be quick, kind of the influx of fanzines and independent record labels, often feeding through independent record shops like Rough Trade, becomes really, really important for punk, absolutely integral to it, really. I talk also about punk in relation to gender and sexuality. Now thankfully there's now an awful lot of writing being done about punk and women, and a lot of great films about polystyrene has come out recently in the Slits. And I talk about the way in which punk created a space for, or women created a space through punk, I should say, in which to kind of express and critique mediated forms and kind of socially constructed forms of femininity. So an influx of women forming bands, being musicians in bands, not just the front people and things like that. There's also a bit of about masculinity as well. And punk can go from your new romantics dressing up in, they're often accused of a very effeminate style, all the way to our kind of second wave skinheads and oi bands, an exaggerated form of masculinity. So under this punk umbrella, you've got real extreme. And for me, that's all part of it. I think it is a space where people are playing out these things, they're having these conversations. The final thing, because I know I need to wrap up, is I then end up punk being a dystopia. Now, we were talking about this before. Punk's dystopian, but ultimately it's quite romantic, really, and quite utopian, because people are doing stuff and they're creating things. And if everyone was really nihilistic and gave up, they just lie in the road and let it all happen. But they don't. They do stuff. They form bands, they release records, they make fanzines. It's a very positive thing. But it presents dystopian visions. And those dystopian visions are, there's a post-industrial Britain, everything's shutting and declining. The post-democratic Britain, Big Brother's coming, authoritarianism's closing down. And then by 1980, with the reignition of the Cold War, a post-apocalyptic world in which the bombs dropped, and punk, in its look even, seems to be like the survivors of the bomb being dropped, stumbling over the rubble. In amongst all the kind of radiation, the kind of skeletal last dregs of humanity existing in the bomb sites. So that's kind of what I do. I kind of wrap up in 1984. Punk obviously goes on and continues to be what it continues to be in lots of different ways. And begins spreading, well, already has by that time begun spreading around the world. But that's really what I do with the book. I try and break it down to themes and look at the various things in which punk engaged with and how it related to the world at the time. So thank you very much.
Now we have an artist, Chris Ren, and he introduced his work, Wuhan Punk, and we will screening the work.
I guess it kind of really started from this meeting that I had with a family friend who was living in London from Wuhan, summer 2019. So he was one of the kind of original participants. He wasn't one of the band members, but he was there from the beginning, documenting, hanging out with them, setting up venues, and he made the first website and everything. So I met up with him, and he told me about the disappearance of my DM, who is somebody I have a very complicated relationship with. I met him in a few different occasions. He was the former band member of Solo. But when I met him, he was already kind of retired. He was translating. He co-founded this kind of anarchist center, which is really this kind of squatted rural housing that also called the Youth Autonomous Center. And he was kind of always around, and I grew up to really. It was also the time when I was coming of age. I was in college. I started kind of reading his writings, and from first time kind of really kind of disliking him to kind of being he's, I don't know, like a groupie of some sort, but more intellectually. And kind of over the years, I've always heard about him, his projects and his kind of collaborations with like my family, friends, and a lot of people I know. And so when I heard about his disappearance, I was really kind of, and also my first video work was about him. I interviewed him in 2010 when I was in college at the Youth Center. So when I first heard about his disappearance, I wanted to do something. I wanted to make a work about him, but somehow the plan just got kind of buried. And when the pandemic started in 2020, and in I think around February, March, I got an interview with this fellowship in America, and this curator wanted to see this work that I made in 2010. And I somehow I couldn't find the footage. I just couldn't. Like my dad didn't have a copy. Like the art museum first showed it, didn't have a copy. I had sent a copy to a professor who commissioned me at the time, and he never replied to my email. So this thing became obviously entangled with what was happening at the time when I was seeing my hometown being bombarded, kind of rendered and re-rendered by all these news footages and voices and sounds and different narratives, and that became the starting point for me to make the project. I wanted to kind of narrate the story through a very personal lens, but at the same time, I started talking to Li Yu, the family from Guangma, in 2019, and Li Juchuan, who was an architect, curator, and who was also very much the original participant in the Wuhan punk movement. And because I was 8 or 9 when it was happening at the time, so it was really obscure to me. I always heard about it as a child, but I never went to see a show when I was a child. So when in order to do the work, I was talking to Li Juchuan and Li Yu for over the course of 3 months, and on WeChat, having kind of Zoom conversations. I wanted to immerse myself into their memory. I wanted to relive their memories, and it was really, really interesting when I was talking to them. Their oral accounts sometimes didn't match up. The starting year, one said 1996, one said 1997, didn't match up, and there's a lot of kind of different places that didn't match up, and so I decided to make something that's very non-didactic, which is kind of the methodology that I always work, and it becomes this work that I started to kind of accumulate different voices and memories of my own, memories of theirs, and things that I sourced from news footage, and the flooding, the sounds of the floods in the year of 1998, and music clips, and it becomes this kind of in a way fluid kind of feeding of these kind of different materials and sounds. And I made the film through archival kind of drone footage and CGI. I used Unreal Engine, gaming engine Unreal. This is the first time I've ever used Unreal. I've never used it before. Before I've used found footage, I've used sound and storytelling. And the reason why I wanted to use Unreal Engine is because I wanted to produce images real time, because in Unreal you could produce a clip of the animation or image really quickly. You can model something and test it out. So that kind of real time rendering was for me very much inherent to the logic of the work, to the way I was working. Yeah, and I guess maybe...
Okay, right, let me do the technology. Can I ask people to maybe, if you have a stool, to fill that space side of it, like over to the front, so people at the back can stand or sit on the floor. we switch off the lights? I should be 12 minutes.
它算是一个过程的项目，上面是不是还在做音乐？上面是不是还在写字？上面是不是还在活着？他以前常常说自己只是个小朋友，但是从未来过武汉这个城市。武汉是个乱七八糟的城市，没有人喜欢这个城市，无论是偶然经过它的地方。是长期生活在这个城市的人。90年代初，他来到武汉这个以肮脏和遭到人们瞩目的城市不大了。重工业的废墟与建筑工地的灰尘交织，鸣笛与死火共存。我对这个城市的记忆最近时而清晰，时而模糊，让我分不清这一切是真实的记忆。还是对过去的方向。在武汉非常听到一种噪音，先让这个超网城市也认识。他曾经说过90年来，在一种沮丧与无奈一切都开始了，然后突然进入了一片喧嚣混乱之中。对武汉很多项目也发生了同样的事情。武汉可能高度解放，不管是同在的问题，他们带着很多的方面，和中国本身生活会是非常不同。他们选择很多音乐是一种纪念感，我自己从小用身体和一些相关的不表达形式。这一切是一种美好的事情。我相信，这种很特别的城市是城市最美的事情。他第一次有个生命之光，参与宇宙中，他很富裕的，就是时尚设计初期，我对于多元化产品的需求重新出现了。他的乐队4个人就是在这个时候开始高兴。加入我。我在这个行业讲过，09年在6月，10年和13年在东北部还这样一个丰富的情形。我们从来说了很多话。但他说出的一切都让我惊心。他曾经给我说出过，他如果被放出来会有点难，尤其是这个很有戏。他说来到武汉前，他在家乡大乡里听老人当3个演员录过的故事。直到大学来到武汉，才接触到。为什么？第4年，他们有一个中国朋友，是130年的朋友，几乎全是看不下的破房子，或者郊区、公路。从伯明翰到巴塞罗那，从哥本哈根到布拉格，他走遍欧洲大陆各大城市的小村镇。拜访各种anarchy朋友的空间。他曾经说，中国居民大部分的人都是同不结婚，以 通过后代却把它们煮熟，当工厂制品变成商品，不符合自然生存法则。在物质的所有物质的世界上，许多非常对空间活动与生的光速上所有的阶层消费上去，是混乱完美的环境。现实中心就是其中之一。不清楚中心所在之地也充满冲突之地，像在温和的城市民主、好心、对他们喜欢的地方。但是刚刚，但是他的自己所不能开始。物质追求永远不是很独特的，不是很竞争的。不达的原则，多难有理解。相信的人生观这样子。我是一个离开所有的事，一个在自己里一个其他人。还有人在原地抽烟，他个人去觉得，这一切都是一个谜，但不知道彼此进行交易，如果是不是在这个其实最开始我们看到的都是那些的，大概就都是三分之一，房子越多，脏话越多。刚开始是他们有翻墙的形式，1982年的时候，这个乐队开始在高校巡演。1995年的时候，有人说我以后会成为王者。02年。Fox 酒吧在15中旁边教堂开了，然后武汉朋克开始在那演。Suburbs 还有光亮朋克音乐，是那个。
向中央国务院国防网络申请发出通知，要求全国有关省市提前做好防大气准备。
去年夏天，武汉狂风雪特别大，雨下得很伤人。大家都说这是武汉过的烟，不是讲实话的会越来越多，然后变成今天刚刚撞一个洞。 经不怎么相干，我还是不晓得他在哪里。有人说他感到冷漠，有人说他跳不远，有人说他被抓起来。10年前我猜到，可是我想跟他一样，照应你死一下。毕竟他与完全的场景早已经销声匿迹。实在是简单的并不是个城市，但我相信还有他很多不应该死。所以是我好像可能去选择这个这个记忆，去选择什么应该是什么，还有人可能睡到了，然后可能在什么事，外面有人的意思。
Next session, I have a couple of questions to both of you, then we can have a conversation. Then the first question is for both of you. The first question is in the documentary, Chris said the punk culture in China appear in Wuhan due to the economic boom, economic flourish. But in Matter's book, you said the British punk appeared in the time of the decreasing of the economic condition and the transformation of economic structure. So I was wondering, do you think punk culture is rooted in economy? And why the opposite thing makes the same punk culture appear in different countries, in China or specific in Wuhan and in the UK? So this is my first question.
Well, so you shouldn't make too formulaic assumptions about form and context.
Yeah.
But there is a relationship. Again, it kind of comes through in the rhetoric of punk and a general kind of. Andy Beckett talks of a mood of declinism in the 1970s, and there's a lexicon of crisis, decline, instability, fragmentation. It's the media language of the time. And British punk very much in dialogue with the media all the time, and so the language the media use, punk kind of uses back. Part of that relates to economics. The most obvious thing is unemployment. Everyone started talking about the clash, right? Some called career opportunities. There's that. But economics is more complicated than that as well, because you've also the economics of the music industry, and punk is partly responding to the economic situation in the music industry, which is becoming far more centralised, and there weren't a lot of spaces opening up for people to find access into the music industry at the time. So I think you can't make too formulaic assumptions from one to the other, but the economic context obviously informed some of the small p politics and what's the right word, performance of punk at the time.
I guess it really happened at a time after, like maybe after, it was a time everything was opening up, and I think it first happened in the context of Wuhan, it happened in contemporary art. There are a lot of artists, especially painters, they were embracing the pop art style, and that later became Hubei pop. And so there was this kind of eagerness to, to learn to work with materials that are, from the West, from America, from Europe, from a context that's very different from China. And I think, in the case of it first happened to pop art in Wuhan, in the case of Wuhan punk, and I think I don't think they had any agenda in the first place. I think one of them was Wu Wei, so he was really the leader. He started the whole movement. He kind of learned about kind of electronic music. He learned to work with MIDI. He learned to work with electronic guitar, and then in Beijing. And then when he came back, he kind of started making kind of in a way versions of punk music that he's heard. And then he befriended a few kind of college students at the time, and then they just formed a few bands, and they started kind of occupying kind of university auditoriums, and they were just performing at spaces where they can, and then they moved to a more kind of in a way more underground settings. They went to bars, they performed at kind of basements that, and I think in a way to act more like a punk musician, because I think the way they learned is that they should perform in basement spaces, they should perform in underground kind of spaces. So I think in a way they beginning they were performing in university, and they slowly move on to more underground kind of spaces, and those spaces were happening when the economy was developing really fast, especially in Wuhan. There, I think people were growing to be. I think people wanted to to understand something. They learned about pop art. They wanted to learn about punk music. They wanted to learn all about these things that are from abroad. And I think it's I think it's more. It has to do with kind of curiosity.
Yeah, I think maybe at that time people just are curious about everything, come from different cultures. So in China, because it just opened the door to the world at that time. So they don't care about punk is punk a critical thing or happy thing or mad thing. They just want to embrace the punk culture at that time. The second one is for Chris. I know the documentary is visual art. We can say it's a visual art, but I'm also interested in your sound. Your sound you use in this work. I think you made a very fascinating soundscape. You use like punk rock sounds, human noise, industrial sounds, broadcasting sounds, and natural sounds. And I think even your Wuhan accent narration is very impressive. It's part of the sound for me. So I think what's your concept of the sound making in your work? And do you have any critical potential in your sound making process? The second one.
I mean, I think the way I was writing, the way I was working with sound, with images was very non-didactic. I was accumulating all these different materials, I think writing came first because I was talking to the original participants. I was, trying to extract their memories, but at the same time, I was learning to listen to Wuhan punk music, and obviously, I think when I immerse myself in other people's memories, in my own memories, it's always, for me, sound. It's always something that comes up first, and I think the year 1998 was talked a lot about by the kind of participants and when I interviewed. And that's a special year because that's the flooding that happened, and there's, I think, the sound of the rainfall, the sound of, like the news excerpts and all these kind of different sounds were a big part of a memory. And I think for me, to work with music was a different kind of process, and I think I had identified 30 seconds of this sound from 生命之饼 called Non-Promise, and I wanted to use it as a way to divide the chapters. And for each chapter, I extract maybe 5 to 10 seconds and then manipulate it in a different way. And sometimes I would stretch it, sometimes I would lower the frequency to match with the rainfall, the sounds of the rainfall. And for me, perhaps that was more deliberate to match with kind of the spatial kind of environment that I was working with. Otherwise, I think it's all very kind of non-didactic.
Okay, next question for Matt. You talk about DIY culture is essential for the punk culture, but today we have DIY culture. We have today digital DIY culture. I think it's quite popular among the digital environment, and every people can make their digital one, and every people can be musician, maybe in 1 minute, and can make their album cover by themselves, and can recording their music by themselves, just upload to the internet. I think quite different, quite similar to the punk scene at 1970s. The punk scene, I think DIY culture in the music in DIY culture is come from punk scene. Is that right? 1970s. So I want to find the connection. Do you think there is any concept continuity between now and the punk culture regarding the DIY culture? Do-it-yourself culture. Yeah. So
I think there is a continuity. I think you can go back before punk, somewhere like skiffle back in the 50s was DIY culture, wasn't it? You made a band by getting on a washboard or a washing up, whatever it would be. Do a bit of that, bit of string on a broom handle, bang bang bang, cheap guitar, got a band. That's how Beatles started. DIY. So there's a continuity through, and depending on the technology available at a particular time, that DIY culture will manifest itself in a different way. The trick is accessibility and having the agency to do it. I think why I think it's important about punk was if the one message from punk was that you didn't have to consume it, you could make it. You didn't have to watch it, you could be it, and it gave people the tools and the inclination and the impetus to do their own thing. And I think that's for me is the most important legacy of punk. And I think it does go through, and you're right. I mean, the context is so much different now. The technology has advanced so much that we can all design our own record covers. Some better than others, I imagine. But you can all design your own record covers, and you can all record your own music. That wasn't possible in quite the same way at the time, so it needed something to show the way, demystify the means of production, the language of the time for some people. Yeah, I think there is a connection. You can trace these lineages through.
Yeah, I think so. The next question for both. We just mentioned the different scenario between Wuhan and the UK. As Matt mentioned, you think in your chapter 8 of your book, you think punk is a dystopia, punk as dystopia. But in your documentary, you think punk is a utopia. It's just a dystopia and a utopia. It's just quite opposite to each other. Maybe we can say different contexts of different political or economic environment. But why? How do you think this different environment makes a different opposite view on this concept, dystopia and utopia?
Well, I mean, punk plays with, in Britain, punk plays with dystopian themes right from the start, and it's because there was a mood of the time. I like these terms like moods and sensibilities. I like the idea of culture being a means by which people try and make sense of things before they've got a language or a real conceptualization to do so. And I think one of the reasons why punk touched a nerve in the 70s and in the 80s for many people was because it tapped into a mood or a feeling of the time, which just doesn't have to be comprehensive. Not everyone feels the same thing in the same way at the same time, but it tapped into a mood that enough people related to in order to have a feeling. And in Britain at that time, there were for many people a certain sense of crisis, decline. The whole process of deindustrialization is ongoing. The Cold War reignites, and I mean that's when I grew up, and we really did all sit there thinking the world's going to end in a couple of days. And I remember watching Threads on television in 1984 and seeing Sheffield get obliterated by a nuclear bomb and thinking that's up the road. That's pretty scary stuff. And so that kind of those kind of feelings I think punk played through. But I think I said earlier, what's interesting about punk, for all its negation and for all its dystopianism, it's actually a very positive and I think quite romantic thing, in that it's all about being creative. It's all about doing. It's not about giving up and succumbing to the dystopian nothingness. It's about taking charge of it and making something positive as a result. So you can have a bit of utopia in your British punk as well.
I do. I mean, I do think it's when I first approached, when I was relearning, before I was talking to like Li Yu and Li Zhichuan, like in my mind I was like, oh, this is resistance, right? Like I felt like, oh, I had this preconception that, oh, this group of 16, 20 youngsters in Wuhan, they were resisting. But then when I learned more, when I talked to more, when I read more, when I especially talking to Li Yu and Li Zhichuan, I found out that they had no idea what they're doing. They were literally just. I think you guys see on the last bit of font footage there was like the fine art universities like Christmas party. They had no idea. They were like everyone was jumping off on the stage, or they were fighting off the mic. They had no rules, and I think they were just excited, right? They were excited that they could do this, and they were just doing it, and I think maybe that's the kind of yeah, I think they were just being creative. They were just creating, and they were excited by all of this energy. And I think before I had a talk with my producer. I think my producer, he had an idea of, he thought, he was like, oh, so are they anti-government? Are they, what's their message and what are they trying to do? But I was trying to tell him, no, like if you read the lyrics of Shen Minzhibing's songs, they're about the names of the songs are like the street names, and he wrote about like love stories that he heard on the street. He wrote about like just like lives like happening in Wuhan. So I think it was quite, I think maybe that's the thing that me myself correcting my preconception. I thought it was resistant, but then only to find out that they were bringing whatever they could into their music and what they're experiencing into the music, and I thought that was great.
Okay, next question. For matter, in your book, you talk about the social, economic, and political environment when the punk emerged. You cite punk emerging from like a time or people think about in the future we will have the intense of the political control and the economic decline and the chaos of the world, the chaos of London, or everything. But now we can say the similar thing happen, like the pandemic, the emergence of new Cold War, and the economic downturn of various countries. And so, do you think now punk culture can be revived at this time, or in a maybe alternative form, or is that already happened? Do you think?
I think people need to stop looking for punk. I think those kind of things will happen, and they probably are happening. I'm an old man now, I don't know what young people are doing, and I'm sure they're doing very exciting things in lots of exciting places, I hope so. But I think punk's become a bit of an albatross, so that everyone's looking for the new punk, the next punk. When grime happened, everyone was saying grime's the new punk, but it's not, it's grime, it's doing its thing. So people will always use culture to critique and to respond to things. I think it's always going to be there. But I think sometimes we just have to let punk go. Okay. Yeah, sure. That's why it's story. I'm just rooted in the past.
Before we go to next session, I want to say I'm translating this book from English to Chinese from 1918 to now. Now I almost finished, but maybe next year when we publish. It's a quite hard book. There are two things for me. It's a very good book. Very good book, actually. Yeah. A lot of good information and good ideas in this book. Maybe let you know, have a new impression of punk and punk history. But I want to say there are two things for me, difficult thing for me during the translation. The first one is the content of the book, because a lot of like radical political idea and some radical scenario in the books. And I forgot to say I was commissioned by Shanghai Social Science Prize to translate this book. So I asked my editor many times about can we publish a book in the full version? I don't want to censor any censorship on this book. She said we will try. So this is the first one. Because a lot of radical things, maybe I'm afraid the government will, or the publisher will afraid of to publish something maybe harmful for their career or something. Yeah. So I hope there will be a full version published next year. Or firstly, it can be published. I don't want to waste my time to publish a book. Publish a good book. Sorry. The next thing is a name of a lot of name of the punk bands is so complex and so hard to translate. You know, there are like hundreds of thousands of bands mentioned in this book, and hundreds of fanzines mentioned in this book. They're very hard to translate. You know, I know some bands maybe appear in like a few months and disappear, and they just use a name for a very short time. Is that right? So and sometimes some name in order to insulting the the police or something like that. So they use a very creepy name to, yeah. And for example, a very famous like Gun of Four, like this kind of name. Maybe it's hard to translate. Yeah.
Is that the easiest one that you had?
Yeah. So.
Robin Bristol.
Yeah. So this is another thing to. For me to translate this book, but hopefully I can achieve my goal to publish the full version of the book and with correct translation of name of the whole bands. I think. So next session for audience. Do you have any question for us?
Yeah. So given we're in a bookshop, can you talk about punk and literature? Is there interaction? I mean, you mentioned dystopia. Anything on this topic? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certain books you see getting referred to quite a lot by books and films, actually, but books, I'll talk about books, in interviews by bands a lot.
Yeah.
One I've already mentioned, George Orwell's 1984. That was in the school curriculum in the 1970s and 80s, I'm pretty sure. It certainly was in the 80s, because I did. But yeah, there's pictures like Paul Weller from the Jam reading 1984. That's referred to a lot. Clockwork Orange was the other one, partly because of the film, although the film was quite difficult to see because it had been withdrawn very quickly after it came out in 1972. But the book was very popular, and Clockwork Orange references repeat over and over again in Sham 69 lyrics, the front cover of an Angelic Upstarts album, just over and over again. Bands dressing a bit like the Druids. So they run through. And the more kind of literary bands do start. I mean, The Fall are named after an Albert Camus novel. The Cure's first single's Killing an Arab about an Albert Camus book. Joseph K is named after a character from Kafka. You know, these literary references through. I mean, you start digging into Joy Division, and Ian Curtis was a very well-read young man. And he weights on his shoulders, and Penguin classics in his pockets. That's what he was. And you can see it in Dead Souls reference to Gogol. So you can see the kind of literary influences coming out into it. And there are kind of punk writing, so it's a tricky, how do you write punk? It's really angry. I mean, there are kind of punk literature, I don't know too much about it. Some of the early books that were written about punk are not particularly good, but I quite like the spirit of the fact that someone's doing it, aren't they? In fact, they did something with nothing.
Any question?
There's a question for Chris. I was curious about Wuhan Punk. I don't know much about it, but how much of a distribution system was there? Did music travel further around China? Because you mentioned, I think, the name, and how much of an impact that song had as a Taiwanese song. I think I was just wondering whether how far did Wuhan Punk spread when it happened?
So that song, Nothing to My Name, was actually it wasn't a Wuhan Punk song. It was like he's like a Beijing musician, and I use it only because Mike Yen referred to that song in one of his writings, and so that was a special song for him. And again, like in the beginning, they weren't labels, they weren't signed to anybody. They were just performing in different venues, hopping around in the city. They weren't even there were posters made, leaving their website, but there was very little sort of kind of infrastructure around that. But obviously, I think later in 2000s, mid 2000s, a lot of the bands, some bands like AB or Cuba, some sort of bands that emerged out of Wuhan Punk, they moved to Beijing, and they signed to Modern Sky, they signed to all these big labels, and but Wu Wei was the Wu Wei Shenfang SCMB, Shengmin being the original, sort of the starter, and he stayed in Wuhan, and he never yeah, he's the one kind of staying in Wuhan, but he did sign with somebody later, and so now you can find their music on Spotify, for instance. But yeah, and I think that actually that's a really good question, because I think that created kind of a divide between the bands, you know, who went north, who signed with big labels, and versus kind of Wu who stayed. And like later, I think Wu would say that he wouldn't call them Wuhan punk anymore, because they became something.
Did the bands that went north stay punk, or when they went to Beijing?
When they went to Beijing, and then there's also and there's also a debate between Beijing punk and Wuhan punk, like who was the first, who was original, like sort of the first one that started the punk movement. And I think there's also that. There's that library.
There's a follow-up question I had to know on learning. Because when I heard that, so when I heard Nothing to My Name in that first part of the film, the association I have with it is that it's played at Tiananmen. And I was wondering, because the Wuhan punk artists are occupying such a personal and local space in what they're making their music about, but especially when you mentioned one of the artists learning electric guitar in Beijing, was some of that previous context there in what they're making work about, but not expressed? So how does that relate?
I mean, Tiananmen is everything, right? Like the reason why a lot of people are here, because we're responding to things. It's everywhere, but we don't talk about it because it's like the air we breathe. You know, it's something that's so heavy that I still don't know how to talk, you know, like it, but somehow like our generation, we learn to live with it, and it's something that I feel like, I don't know, I feel like I wasn't responding to that, you know, and I think not necessarily dumb either, and I think obviously it's, you know, there's so many things that you can respond to there, but I think when I talk to them, it wasn't so much about resistance to start with. That wasn't the intention, their intention. I mean, you might be written about in a different way, but I think for them, they were just like, you know, Wei learned electronic guitar, and he heard the Pogues and so forth, and then he loved it, and then he brought it to Wuhan, and he influenced his friends, and then they were doing it, and I don't think they knew about, you know, the kind of the political connotations with it, and but I don't know, but if you talk to him now, maybe he will say something else. But I'll just look at that.
I think that's a very interesting observation. I don't know how to make of it, because, well, the fact that from the perspective of cultural critique or academic, something that might seem to be resistant or backed by a political agenda, but when you actually talk to the people who are doing it or practicing it, they say, I'm just having fun, I just find it interesting. I don't know how do you make this, make sense of this kind of gap? And actually it's
I mean, obviously, I made the work in 2020, and there's Wuhan 2020, and I think for me, yes, there's a lot of resistance, right? Like I think the way people are appropriating, you know, like the name of the city, the way they render the city, the way how, you know, how personal and collective are so intertwined. I think, yeah, I mean, that's my intention, right? But I think, again, when I talk to them, that wasn't their intention. And I think, again, I'm also only talking about sort of the starting point of their intentions. Obviously, the context was different. The context was a very open, very curious, you know, like place or context. But then in 2000s, like mid-2000s, mid-2000s, like that was different. And when Wuhan Punk retired, they founded Youth Autonomous Center, which is an anarchist space, and that's clearly resistant, right? That's just from the name of it, from everything they were doing. So the work, so I wasn't, so again, like I think the question was more about punk music, the movement itself. When I talked to them, it wasn't so much about resistance, but obviously the work wasn't just about the movement, right? It was about like a Youth Autonomous Center. Because the work is about Maidian, and you know, Maidian, like he has very clear intention out of everybody. He found his writing, you know, from the way he was doing punk, and then he found the Youth Autonomous Center. But I think not everyone else in a way. So I think the work is centers around Maidian, and obviously, I mean that's, you know.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a strong sense of resistance and antagonism in there, especially in the case of Tiaodonghu, like when the real estate company was trying to kind of fill the lake or replace part of the lake with development. But I just want to share this because I'm quite interested in the contemporary art scene in China and in Wuhan. I've never been to the city, it's a pity, but I know that there's this place, just an example, it's called Feichuan. It's still kind of operating. It's like a very autonomous artists run space, and they do all kinds of interesting things, including like very situationist performance, and they would just do noise, improvising, you know, with all kinds of instruments. But when a friend of mine went to them and asked, like, why are you doing this? They said, like, we're just having fun. And that, and also we have to acknowledge that by saying that, they don't have to mean it. It could be a very performative concert for good reasons. But I'm just wondering this, because in your talk, Professor Waller, like this cultural critique is very important to the punk culture here. But I'm not sure if that is still kind of existent. Well, because if you look at the title of your book, No Future, I'm interested in this idea of future, futurity, and I immediately think of figures like Mark Fisher, who was writing about the cancellation of future, I mean, in relation to punk and capitalist realism. And we heard it in this. So.
Going back to from where you came in on it, I think it's really interesting about what people say and what they're doing, because, yeah, absolutely, you're bound to say, I'm not political at all, you know, we're just having fun, and they're writing a song about unemployment. You know, so why are you writing a song about unemployment if you're not bothered about anything, stuff like that? And early on, in Sniffing Glue, actually, there's a really good an interview with the Damned one week, where they're talking about what punk is, and they're saying, oh, punk's nothing, it's just rock and roll, it's just the music of now. And the next issue, there's the Clash going, no, punk's it's a protest, it's a this, that, and the other. And Mick Jones from the Clash says he had an argument with Brian James from the Damned, where Brian James said punk was just about having fun, and Mick Jones was saying, no, it's about resistance. You know, and so within the milieu of the time, people are having these conversations about meaning. I always say there's something inherent in what tends to be recognised as punk that is somehow critical of something or other, but that could just be critical of not liking the music that's on the radio, wanting to make something different, or not liking a certain sensibility that's prominent and doing the opposite. But it can also go much deeper, and what I find interesting about punk is just how deep it can go when you start peeling it, and you end up with artists like Linda Sterling's work, you know, which is, for me, is just fantastic and has an awful lot of meaning. Is a fantastic critique of the media and gender and sexuality translated through the media. So it's one of those things where it gets complicated and multifaceted as you go down. But No Future, Mark Fisher's work I find really interesting, and that kind of sense in which everything's kind of run its course, but trying to find a way out. And he's another one who's writing, I found, by turns kind of, not depressing, that's the wrong word, but kind of despondent, but also quite inspiring at the same time. And that dichotomy I quite like, and I've always liked that. Kind of out of nothing will come something.
Maybe another thing is because in your book you mentioned you have one chapter talk about boring. Maybe because of boring something. You think everything is boring, so you want to create a media to express.
Boredom's a great stimulus to do something.
Yeah, boredom. Yeah.
Boredom.
Maybe just bored.
I like boredom. Boredom's good.
Other questions?
Just to follow up on that, is there something about like insecurity as well? Like if you don't care about something, if you're bored, you don't make yourself vulnerable because you don't. You know what I mean? There's something.
Yeah.
Is there something about that in punk as well? Or not wanting to be vulnerable, or not wanting by not caring about anything, because then no one can, you know.
Yeah, there's an affectation about it, without a doubt. I think there's also a negative connotation to it. It's a kind of getting rid of any responsibility for everything. If you say, I don't care about anything, it means nothing to me, you're basically giving up your sense of responsibility, isn't it? So, and that can be really annoying in punk, I think, that kind of response. But I think there is elements. I mean, the other thing is, it's a lot of people we're talking about, it's kind of teenagers coming of age, isn't it? So there's that whole thing of growing up, which is really important. It's in there, and the pains of adolescence and becoming. Another thing we didn't really talk about is that punk is a space for self-reinvention or self-creation, which I think is another kind of interesting. You try things out. I'm doing book on fanzines at the moment. I'm quite interested in the way in which people are experimenting with their politics and fanzines. You're taking an argument to an extreme, testing it in a small environment. Another part of punk literature is the fanzines part of punk literature. And anyway, a lot of people go on through music journeys. They learn to write through writing in fanzines. There's a lot of posturing.
Okay, last question. Anyway.
It's probably completely stupid, but do you recognize any punk DNA in Trump and the movement he built up?
No. I think punk's a creative thing. Just by being someone who kicks a chair over or is disruptive, I don't see that as being punk. I think it's a creative thing. Punk doesn't punch down. Generally punches up, so I don't see anything punky.
It's funny you mentioned because in a way, the founder of Shemi, when I talked to him, he's actually pro-Trump, and that's something I find quite. He's pro-Trump. He's anti BLM. Like all these things, like make me really kind of see my card, and I think. Again, like back to the resistance question, I think these kind of like ask somebody who's so influential, but then like I couldn't tell if it was performative. I couldn't tell if he was trying to resist a mainstream, sort of leftist, like that made me quite. I don't understand.
I think this is similar to the UK because punk, maybe if people don't know a lot about punk, they think it's about left-wing culture, or left-wing movement, or left-wing music. But actually, punk have all the different political view: left, radical left, right, radical right, and punk just want to against anything. I think. So, for example, in this book, you talk about some right-wing movement related to punk, like National Front, like British movement, and Rock Against Communism, and associated with OE movement. Yeah, right.
OE is a bit more complicated, but there were bands like that, but they were really small. None of them released records in the 70s. The inaugural gig of Rock Against Communism had 150 people there, if you believe one report, 70 if you believe another report, so let's put it in a minute. At Conway Hall, actually. It's pretty marginal, but you do get people saying reactionary things, and, without a doubt, because it was of the time when people are kind of.
You also have that kind of space.
I never think about punks being a movement, and I don't think about punks having a particular agenda. I think it's a contested space in which people can input and develop different politics. But I think the right, in terms of the right wing of punk, was very small for a long time, and then develops through this kind of global blood and honour network in the 1980s. And also it's the idea of punk being something that you are. I'm always a bit suspicious of that for the same the affectation reason. I always think punk's more something that you do. And so when people say, "Oh, yeah, I'm a punk," well, how do you make a cup of tea in a punk way? Walk down the street in a punk way. I mean, I just find that kind of cringy. But when someone's like kind of doing something, they're creating something, using the kind of processes of using what you've got around you, doing it yourself, finding the whole space to do it, that's where the punk thing. I was being a bit flip earlier about saying we should let punk go. Punk has a legacy and goes on. It's that thing that enables people to do something.
One more question from me. I see Vivian Vessel called Assange is a true punk. How do you think about that?
Who?
Vivian Vessel, one of the founder of the punk culture. Vivian Vessel.
Oh, Vivian Westwood, yeah.
Yeah. He said Assange is a true punk.
I'm thinking she's popping up. She's still kind of.
She's the founder of one of the founder of the Sex Pistols, right?
Yeah, she's annoyed about lots of stuff, and good luck to her, I think. And yeah, and I like her backstory. And, she's been a teacher, and she gave up being a teacher, and she's now the world's one of the most famous fashion designers. Yet she never went to fashion college. So yeah, good luck to her.
Okay, to wrap up, we have the book inside the bookshop. So Professor Mark Woolley, happy to sign if you like.
I don't want to put the cost down.
Okay, thank you very much.